I think I was sexually abused. I've been struggling with this for a long time and I just need a place to lay my thoughts down. I'm 25M and from an African country where being gay is outlawed. You can get arrested and jailed for over 10 years on the basis of your sexuality. You are one of the lucky ones if you do get arrested, as a lot of LGBTQ people were often burned alive on the streets up until a few years ago. My cousin 35M had a rough upbringing. His mother was very abusive to him. She dated my uncle and got pregnant with my cousin, and our tradition doesn't look kindly on women who have kids outside marriage, so her marriage to my uncle was arranged. She didn't want that and blamed my cousin for being the reason she got stuck with the marriage, and so she hated him for it. She had 8 other kids, but she treated him the worst. My mum on one of her trips to the village saw the maltreatment he endured, and with his parents' consent, she took him with her from the village back to the city where he lived with us. I was born in the year he came to live with us. The earliest memory I have of the abuse goes back to maybe when I was 5 or 6. We lived in a 3-bedroom apartment. My parents shared a room. We had a room for the girls. My aunt as well as any female visitors stayed there. And a room for the boys. I slept in the same room as him. I slept close to the wall, and some nights he'd push up behind me and press himself against me. He'd sometimes touch me inappropriately, but back then I didn't know that there was anything wrong with that. When I turned 8/9 and he was 19, my mum got pregnant and we moved into our home. It was a 5-bedroom home, but we were boys and still ended up sharing a room. I'd always done well in school, so I was allowed to skip a few grades. I was in JSS1, junior secondary school, or 7th grade at the time. I was in boarding school, but I'd often go home for breaks. One night, he pulled out his private part and asked me to touch it, which I did. He asked me to rub it, and I did that as well. We'd do this for about an hour each night, and sometimes he'd kiss me or ask me to pull my shorts down and he'd rub up his private part against my backside. I was 9 but in junior secondary school and a boarding school. Most of my classmates were 11, so I'd been exposed to some aspects of sex, so I knew what he was doing, but I didn't feel like it was wrong, nor did I feel violated. At some point, I began looking forward to it, so it became a habit. Whenever I was home for breaks or holiday, we'd engage in these sexual acts every night. I never mentioned this to anyone, not because I was afraid or because he asked me not to, but I think because I didn't want it to stop. When I turned 13 and he was 24, things got more intense. I had begun thinking of boys sexually at this time, but I was afraid to ever open up to anyone at that time. My friends were 15 at the time. I was the youngest in my class because I skipped a few grades. And all into girls and talking about the girls they liked, etc., whereas I never really partook in such conversations. For all intents and purposes, I was a nerd who was only ever interested in my studies. When I did come home for breaks or holiday, he'd amp up the things we did at night. He taught me how to give a blowjob, and I began doing that to him at night. I didn't derive any sexual pleasure doing these things, but there was a part of me that enjoyed doing it. Maybe because he seemed to enjoy having me do these things to him. At 13, I was in SS1, senior secondary, or 10th grade, and I was fully aware about sex now. One day he tried to have penetrative sex with me, but it hurt a lot and he never did it again. One night when I was giving him a blowjob, he pushed me off and he ended up coming all over himself. It was the first time this had ever happened. Usually, we never got to the point where he'd come. He always stopped me and we'd go to bed. That night, however, things felt different. After he orgasmed, he kissed me and hugged me and we fell asleep. He taught me what masturbation was and introduced me to a wider array of pornography, and I got addicted to it at a point. He'd sometimes have me play with or suck on his nipples. There were so many things he taught, introduced me into, and my parents never knew about any of this. Looking back, he was very discreet. We only did these things at night, and he had a girl he was dating at that time, so no one ever suspected anything. When I turned 15 in 2012, I graduated from high school. I wanted to study abroad, so my dad found a school in my country that offered the Cambridge A-level course, and I did that for a year before traveling in 2013. After traveling, we never did any of that anymore, even when I was home. Looking back now, when I was in my first year in the university, I had an overwhelming urge to meet up with a lot of guys. Maybe I was trying to explore, or maybe I had a very high sex drive at 16, but I know I struggled with porn and masturbation addictions for a really long time. Even now writing this, I feel conflicted. Was this sexual abuse? Assault? I do not feel violated, and I have no PTSD associated with any of these memories. I am very indifferent to it, and it just feels like one of many memories from my childhood. In fact, like I stated earlier, a part of me enjoyed what we did. Am I supposed to feel differently? Is there something wrong with me for not feeling violated? I honestly do not know, but this has been on my mind quite a bit lately, and I just needed a place to write it all down. Light0296 commented, "Honestly, you were. I do understand that you enjoyed it and have fond memories of it. But you have to understand that the fact that this was done to you when you were 5 or 6 could be an explanation. You're at an age where you don't know what sexual pleasure is and being introduced to it. Obviously it will feel good, but that's just because your brain releases chemicals that make you feel good. I too was touched as a boy by a lady in the neighborhood. It felt good when it happened, but that doesn't really mean it was good. More often than not, kids do feel good when they are stimulated, but it's still very wrong to do so, because it affects how they perceive sex in the future, and even pleasure for that matter. You could say that your addiction to porn has something, if not everything, to do with the fact that you were touched as a child.